You're listening to Mark of the Maker. Hey everybody, you're listening to Mark of the Maker, and I'm Mark Steiner, and this is our very first mini episode or minisode that we're going to put out there for you folks to listen to. The reality is that with a 4-person podcast crew, we sometimes have some difficulty getting everyone's schedules in order, and with shows and show prep and family life, sometimes gets a little bit complicated. So we decided to experiment with this idea of some minisodes to give you something to listen to in the meantime. There's sort of the guess here is that this is going to be a much shorter thing than what you're used to from Mark of the Maker, but at least it'll give you something to listen to, and along the same kind of line that we've been doing with the show, maybe to fill in between episodes if we need a little bit of a break, a little bit longer break than normal. That's the idea anyway. I think maybe there's going to be a series of these if this all works out. And what we're going to talk about are influences. And before we get too deep into that, I better make sure that my partner is here. Today it's just myself and Mr. Sean Kendrick. How are you, Sean?
I am dandy, chomping at the bit and ready to go.
Yeah, so maybe as no surprise to listeners, Sean had an idea here about talking a little bit about a literary piece and how it fits in with kind of what he does, and maybe a little bit with what each of us do around knives, and how that may have influenced, or definitely influenced, what he does, and how far-reaching that is on his side. So, Sean, you want to talk a little bit more about that, like why we're doing this and sort of what the topic is?
Yeah, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to give a quick reading from one of my favorite books. It's In the Rogue Blood by James Carlos Blake, and I'll repeat that because you should go look it up on Amazon. In the Rogue Blood by James Carlos Blake. And all of his stuff's fantastic, but this is probably his masterwork. It won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for Fiction, several other awards, the Los Angeles Times Prize being the most major. And it's widely considered to be the most violent book in American literature. And the passage I'm going to read from really caught my imagination. It put me into a Bowie knife kind of frame of mind. And I did a lot of Bowies at that time, at least a lot for me. And I just wanted to share this with everybody because it's an excellent passage. It captures the imagination, and the author deserves exposure. I just wanted to share.
So, Sean, for the folks listening, is this a modern author or an author back in history some amount of time?
No, I believe this book came out early 90s, late 80s.
Okay.
Give me just a second to check inside the cover here. 1997.
Oh, wow.
Be right.
Okay.
And like I said, this is his masterwork. I consider Blake as having a big 3 in his lineup, and that's In the Rogue Blood, Redgrass River, and Wildwood Boys. All 3 are fantastic books. All 3 deal with violence. They deal with the violence in America and how it's part of our culture. In the Rogue Blood deals with the violence inherent in America's manifest destiny. And he handles it well. He handles it with aplomb, and he takes characters that are hard to like, and he makes them sympathetic. You can't help but like them despite all their faults.
Okay. And in this case, like you said, the section that you're going to read really includes or involves an aspect about knives.
Yes, very prominently. Well, a saber and a knife. So I'll preface with where we're going to be starting in the book. The book is about John and Edward Little. They're 2 brothers who grow up in Florida in an abusive home. They take off to find their fortunes from that, and eventually they end up involved in the Mexican-American War. One of them actually comes into the war from being part of a scalp hunting party, which is a very interesting part of the book. But where we are right now, they've left Florida, they've been separated, and Edward has ended up in Louisiana, and he's out drinking, and that's where we pick up.
So, like you said, this is one of the most violent authors or book series. You want to talk a little bit about warning for folks who might have aversion?
Yeah, we should preface this. This is kind of real grisly violence. It's very savage and pretty realistic as far as I can tell, at least the way I picture it in my mind.
I think savage is a very, very good word for it.
Oh, the whole book's about savagery, man. There is just awful shit that happens to people. I mean, if nothing else, it should get the award for most genital mutilation in 300 pages.
Yikes.
Yeah. Like I said, the scalp hunting party part's a little rough.
I think one of the interesting parts about that, though, is the reality that doesn't always get taught in history class, right? That in real life, in history, there's a lot of ugly shit that happens.
Mm-hmm. Consistently across the board.
Right. And people were exposed to violence and savagery and just the reality of diseases and other stuff at a much deeper level than I think lots of people in modern day really have any appreciation for.
The book deals with disease too. It's wonderful. It hits on all cylinders.
It's bad shit all around.
All around, man. If it's a negative part of the human condition that's painful and brings about sorrow, it probably gets touched on.
There you go.
Yeah, good times.
All right, man. Well, why don't you take us through this section of the book and we'll have a little conversation after that.
Will do. Emerging from the alleyway, he saw a small crowd looking on as DeQuince's 2 officer students crossed sabers in the street, shuffling to and fro, thrusting and parrying as the master stood by and observed them, sipping from his flask. Abruptly, he barked, "Non!" and the swordsmen stepped back from each other and gave him full attention. DeQuince handed the flask to a red scarf student and gestured for one of the officers to come to him. He took the soldier's saber and softly discussed with him some point of technique, and then he stepped out to face the other officer and said, "En garde." The officer saluted with his blade and assumed the ready position. The maître d'armes' own guard posture was languid, the saber drooping loosely in his upraised right hand, his left hand on his hip almost girlishly. He seemed bored. He showed a small smile and asked something, and the officer nodded curtly and worked his fingers tightly on the hilt, and his aspect was utterly serious. Thus poised, the officer began circling DeQuince slowly. The master moved with him as smoothly as if the ground itself were revolving under him, smiling easily. And then he yawned hugely, and the onlookers laughed. Even in the streetlight's weak illumination, Edward could see the flush on the officer's face and the angry tightening of his lips. The officer thrust, and DeQuince parried with the barest flick of wrist and no change of posture or expression whatsoever. He made a remark in French that drew laughter from the other students, and the officer flushed more deeply still. Another intent thrust glanced off another casual parry. The officer fainted, and DeQuince laughed aloud, and the soldier's face clenched in fury. He lunged in a thrust meant to skewer DeQuince's heart, but the master sidestepped easily, and his brightly blurred blade entwined itself around the officer's saber and snatched it from his hand and sent it arcing through the air, turning end over end. The spectators were applauding as the sword clattered to the ground at Edward's feet. As the officer stalked over to retrieve his weapon, Edward bent to pick it up with the intention of handing it to him, but before his fingers touched the hilt, the soldier roughly shoved him aside and snarled, "Get away, you damned river trash," and stooped for the saber himself. Reacting without thought, Edward backhanded him in the side of the head with the heel of his fist. The officer staggered sideways and fell to all fours, and Edward kicked him in the stomach, knocking him onto his side, and then kicked him in the head, spinning him over on his face. The officer lay still and breathed wetly against the cobblestones. The crowd stared at Edward in slack-jawed silence. He cursed himself for his stupidity as he stood facing them. "It's a bunch of them, and you got no gun, you damn fool." His only arms were his knives, the boot knife, the snap handle in his pocket, the big bowie flat against his belly. Now the other officer said, "You snipjack bastard," and went for his pistol, but DeQuince slapped his blade against the man's belted flintlock to stay his hand. The officer stared at the maître d'armes in confusion. DeQuince shook his head and then advanced on Edward with an air of indolence, smiling easily, the saber dangling at his side. The fallen soldier lay on his pistol, and Edward sensed that if he tried for it, the maître d'armes would run him through on the instant. DeQuince closed to within easy sword thrust, and there paused, his smile remote, his eyes as devoid of malice as of warmth. Bored eyes, indifferent to whether they looked upon rain or blood or sparkling wine. Edward had not seen eyes like them before. DeQuince addressed him softly in French. Edward shrugged. The master-at-arms smiled and tilted his head and looked at him with slitted eyes as if trying to see him in clearer focus, then spoke again, more loudly, and the onlookers all laughed. "He had no call to put hand to me," Edward said. He did not know if the maître d'armes spoke English. The bowie in his belt felt far from his hand. DeQuince again spoke in French, and the rising inflection of his words suggested he was making inquiry. Edward shrugged and said, "Shit, I don't talk Frenchman." The master of arms pulled a mock-serious face and shrugged hugely in exaggerated mimicry, and the spectators laughed. A rush of anger burned Edward's ears. He turned his head and spat, and in the same moment DeQuince's saber flashed up and flicked away the top button on his shirt. The crowd laughed more loudly yet. Edward backed up a step, and without seeming to move at all, DeQuince kept the same distance between them. The saber tip rested lightly on Edward's chest just under the second button. Edward raised his hand to push the saber away, and in a move faster than the eye, DeQuince slapped his wrist with the flat of the blade, and with a backhand flick took away the second button, and the sword tip now dimpled the cloth under the third. Again, Edward backed up a step, and DeQuince moved with him as effortless as shadow. The crowd applauded. "You son of a bitch," Edward said through his teeth. With the barest sidelong turn of his head, DeQuince said something loudly and pricked the crowd to laughter again. He flicked away the third button, and the saber tip dropped to the fourth. Something batted the plume in DeQuince's hat as it sailed past his head and shattered on a wall. A bottle flung by Keeler, who stood drunkenly grinning from the entrance of the Whole World Hotel with Allenbeck swaying alongside him and yelling, "Hey, you fucking Monsieur bastard, try that on me, why don't you?" In the instant DeQuince's eyes cut to the saloon doors, Edward snatched the saber blade tightly with his left hand and ignored its burning incision into his palm as DeQuince's hold on the hilt tightened reflexively, and Edward yanked the blade sidewise and pulled him off balance, and the bowie was now in Edward's right hand, and he thrust it to the hilt in DeQuince's belly. The master of arms' eyes went very wide and white and were not at all bored now, and his lips puckered as if for a kiss. Blood gloved Edward's hand as he shoved down hard on the haft, and the razorous blade slid easily through gut and organs and gristle and struck bone, and he leaned harder into the knife to cut through it, and the blade sliced through DeQuince's crotch and came free in a great hot rush of entrails. He released the saber and jumped back, and DeQuince stood wavering and staring down horrified at his viscera, unraveling to his feet with a soft hiss, and he sank to his knees and fell forward into the spilled ruin of his life.
Awesome.
Man, it spoke to me. It caught my attention and stayed in my head that I did quite a few Bowie-shaped blades, even though I hate grinding the sons of bitches on the swedge.
Right.
I had to get them out of my head.
Yeah.
And every one I was grinding, I was just thinking, hell yeah, cut a motherfucker in twain.
Right, right. Very interesting. We talked before we recorded this episode, and I love that last line.
Oh, yeah. It is poetic.
Yeah.
And fell forward into the spilled ruin of his life.
Yeah. Bam. So this is a perfect example, and we've talked about this, I think, in an earlier episode or two, about the very personal nature of knives in general.
Yeah.
And it seems like this is a great example of that, right? These are guys that are arm's length from one another or close, and that's a different thing, right? I mean, it's different than sometimes I think people think about, right? People that carry a firearm or whatever, you never let yourself get that close, right? That's one of the guidelines. But in this case, that's all there is, at least in this particular encounter. And it's very up close and personal thing that happens.
Well, where this takes place and the point in time it takes place, they actually make a point of, at one point in the book, they get Patterson revolvers, and it's one of the first shipments of Patterson revolvers, which was the first 6-shot revolving handgun.
Nice.
So most of the other firearms in the book are single shot. They're flintlocks and muskets and black powder weapons like that.
Yeah. So for you, what did this thing trigger in you? I know you mentioned when you're grinding a Bowie and thinking about what that knife is all about, right?
Yeah. Well, there's a description of the blade earlier in the book where he wins it in a card game, and it's a very wide-bladed clip point Bowie knife. It says it's about a 2.5-inch wide blade, ground razorously thin at the edge.
Huh, very cool.
Yeah, and what it paints for me in my mind is kind of the traditional brassback or copperback Bowie, or kind of an Alamo-style Bowie.
Right.
Basically a short sword.
So in addition to thinking about this kind of knife when you're actually grinding one, are there design influences that come out of this for you as well?
Man, with this, it was primarily the Bowie thing.
Yeah.
It just really stuck with me. And I'd like to do more if I just didn't hate grinding that friggin' inward curving swedge so much.
Right, right.
Because without that inward curving swedge, it's just a clip point, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. Yeah, well, maybe it just kind of fits with the overall aesthetic of what most of your designs really are geared toward, right? I mean,
oh, yeah. Well, I mean, it's a little dramatic. It's a little excessive, and I enjoy that.
Right. Right. And I mean, it kind of fits with the, your slogan, innovations in aggression, right? I mean,
definitely aggressive. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it fits in with all that, whether directly or otherwise. Certainly there's a line to be drawn between the two.
Very much so. In the book, I mean, it shows how important knives were, or just edged weapons were in general in combat at that point in time. I mean, there's a lot of spears, a lot of bowie knives, a lot of sabers. And you saw our main character at that point had 3 knives on him, period.
Right, right. Very cool.
Well, I enjoy it, and I wanted to share it, and hopefully at least a couple people get a kick out of it.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes that's what we try to do with a lot of our conversations we've had so far, is to get people thinking a little bit and maybe looking in a little bit different place for things, whether it's things like this or designs or makers or otherwise, right?
Yeah. I mean, if it grabs you, chase it. See what you can do with it. I mean, hell, I've seen lines on buildings, and I'm like, wow, that'd look great on a handle. How am I going to incorporate that?
Right, right. Anything else you want to say about this topic or this particular book, Sean?
Man, I just recommend it highly. It's a very well-written book, very realistic. I mean, John Steinbeck would be like, wow, that's some realism right there, man.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Now, you mentioned early on that this was one of 3.
Yeah, what I consider to be his big 3. I think he's published 8 or 9 novels now, and I've read all of them, but the 3 that I like the very best, and they're all from around the same time frame in his writing career, are In the Rogue Blood, Red Grass River, and Wildwood Boys. And I've told what In the Rogue Blood is about. Red Grass River is about the Ashley crime gang in Florida in the 1920s.
Oh, yeah.
Very, very interesting read. Once again, historical fiction. And then Wildwood Boys is historical fiction again about Captain William T. Anderson during the Kansas-Missouri border conflict of the Civil War, a.k.a. Bloody Bill Anderson.
Very cool. So historical-based literature, right?
Yep. Yeah. Well, In the Rogue Blood has cameos by a couple historical figures, and everything that takes place is chronologically correct and historically correct. He covers the historical aspect of it fantastically. Everything's period proper.
Excellent. All right. Well, the last thing I expected when we started out doing a podcast about knives was that we were going to end up with a reading list, but we've done a hell of a job of that so far, I think.
It's like reading Rainbow, man.
No doubt. All right. So assuming this whole thing sees the light of day, which I strongly suspect it will, we'll put a link. Maybe you can post some links, Sean, in our Facebook group, the Mark of the Maker Facebook group, to help folks find this stuff.
Oh, I'll definitely follow up.
Yeah, that'd be very cool. All right. Well, like we mentioned earlier, this is kind of an experimental thing. The idea of a short mini-sode to get you exposed to some other stuff and give you some things to think about between main episodes of Mark of the Maker. We try to hit a 2-week cadence, but it doesn't always work out that way. And if you guys enjoy this kind of stuff, we have lots of other directions that this same influences topic could go. And we can work on having a few more of these to help fill some gaps between shows. So we'd be very interested in your feedback, whether it's in the Facebook group for Mark of the Maker or through our Instagram account. Folks don't seem to be too shy about sending us email. We get a lot of those. So, let us know what you think.
Yeah, good, bad, or indifferent. Let us know.
Exactly. Yep. So if you think we should do more of these to kind of help fill the gap or even give you some other things to think about, I think this one's a slightly tangential, but I think it still fits very well with the overall arc of the show. So I'd be interested to hear what people think.
And if they like it, there's more books to read.
There you go.
More to be talked about. Hell, it ain't got to be just this.
Right. Art, all kinds of different things that could fit in, I think.
All kinds of things. Oh, especially art. We don't got time for that, and everybody else ain't here.
Mark, this was supposed to be short.
Hey, man, with how we gab, we're still at the short mark as far as I'm concerned.
Exactly. Well, Sean, very cool idea. I appreciate you bringing it up, and it was a very interesting conversation. So we appreciate everybody listening, and thanks for following the show.
Thanks for humoring me, folks. I hope you enjoy it.
To learn more about our makers, you can find Tom Crine on the web at crineknives.net, in his Facebook group, Crine Knives, or in his Instagram account, at Crine Knives. For Michael Birch, check birchtreeblades.com, Facebook group Birch Tree Blade Works, or Michael's Instagram at birchtreeblades. For myself and the Raygun Bead Project, we're on the web at raygundivision.com. We have a Facebook group called Raygun Division, or my personal Instagram at msteiner. For those interested in photos, references from the show, or some discussion about the show itself, you can find us on the web at markofthemaker.com, in a Facebook group called Mark of the Maker, or on our Instagram at Mark of the Maker. Last but not least, the ultra cool and haunting background music we use for the show is a piece called Noir Guitar by Stevie's Amp Shack, found at the Free Music Archive and licensed under Creative Commons CC BY 4.0. Thanks for listening.